You're listening to The Big Album Show with Paul Dillon and Dan O'Neill. Hello and welcome to The Big Album Show. I'm Dan.
And I'm Paul.
Today we're talking about one of U2's least popular albums, I think it's fair to say. Although on The Big Album Show, it's very, very popular because I know that Paul and I are a fan of this album. Of course, the album we're talking about is Pop by U2, released in 1997. And it is true to say that critics at the time dissed it a little bit, didn't see it as U2's best work. But I think that as time has gone by, it has stood the test of time and it sounds as relevant and as good as ever. What do you think about this album, Paul?
Well, I think you just nailed it there from the get-go, in the sense that this album divides opinions, divides loyalties, and still 25 years throws up questions. It's an unfinished record by the band's own admission, and you can hear that at times in the recording. It spawned the joint juggernaut of the PopMart Tour, which I saw in Dublin, 31st of August, 1997. It spawned 5 singles, and you mentioned the mixed reviews. That is certainly true, and it did achieve mixed reviews. But what I think is remarkable about this record, and there's a lot of things that are quite remarkable, but the main takeaway that I have is that what this album does is it finds a halfway point between an experimental sound, in the sense of the dance influence that's throughout the album, and also, as the title suggests, a very mainstream pop record. Now, I think the album bridges those two instincts, if you like, the instinct to be experimental and the instinct to sort of ride the wave of the sounds that were dominant in the mid to late 90s. I think it's a great record, right? I'm just going to nail my colours to the mat from the get-go on it. I am big about this record. I love the pure 90s of it all really appeals to me. It captures something in the zeitgeist of 1997. And you know, for me, the record still stands up today, and I really like it and enjoy listening to it, and it's been a part of my life for 25 years. But one of the interesting things, Dan, is that 25 years after its release, it received very little fanfare in terms of there's never been an anniversary for this record, and I don't think there ever will be. And that reveals, I think, very mixed feelings on the part of the band about this record.
Yeah, it's always been a central U2 album for me, just because of my age, and it's kind of like, you know, I was 11 when this album came out, so it's smack bang at the beginning of my own musical development as a music fan. So it was really one of the albums, one of the first U2 albums that I took a deep dive into, and I love the fact that it's called Pop to start with, because in the 1990s, not so much anymore, but in the 1990s and before then, we've talked about it on the show before, music was taken an awful lot more seriously than it is today. And there was this kind of attitude towards bands, that bands mustn't sell out, bands must stick to a particular genre, bands shouldn't get too creative because, you know, if they veer too close to pop music, they'll become uncool. But U2 literally said, fuck that, with the name of this album, named it Pop. And Bono, talking to Niall Stokes in Hot Press at the time, spoke about the name of the album, and he said, the indie scene is such a con. We're supposed to feel guilty about being successful, but that's what we wanted from the very beginning. We wanted to be the biggest band in the world. And The Edge said, in this album, we wanted to let the spirit of dance music emanate through the album. And really kind of, they talked about really trying to grab the zeitgeist of the time. And I think you hear that right through the album. And we'll get to the songs in a few moments. But like, when you put this album side by side with albums from other groups and musicians that came later, like I'm thinking of the likes of Tame Impala or even Radiohead or even Damon Albarn's Gorillaz, which mixed guitar with drum samples, with synths. It doesn't feel as strange an album as it perhaps did back in 1997. And I think U2 did tap into a zeitgeist, or maybe the zeitgeist yet to come, because 1997 was an interesting year in music. If you think about 1997, you had bands like dance music like Underworld was big, and you had Born Slippy, and Train Spotting was released around that period, and that kind of scene was happening. You also had Daft Punk releasing their first album, which was really groundbreaking. And often when you turned on MTV or MTV Europe at the time, you would have the video for Staring at the Sun, or Discotheque, side by side with the video for Daft Punk's Around the World. So they really did tap into this zeitgeist, as U2 always do so well. So like, and at the end of the day, there's plenty of bangers on this album as well.
Yeah, I love all that, Dan. I mean, I think, what we're trying to do on the Big Album Show really is just put on record the sort of conversations that we have about music anyway. I think what you're saying there really sums up something for me, which is very, very important, which is the idea of a band capturing something in the times, and it does feel almost a 1990s thing to say, because that was something that bands frequently tried to do in that era, which was which was to kind of capture the sound of the day and then try and kick it forward. And so you hear that so much of what was big in the 90s you can hear on this record. The Britpop sound, really clear on Staring at the Sun, for example, with the old wah-wah guitar. Remember that? The wah-wah effect. You see a little lad in hot press, guitar player wanted, must be able to do wah-wah effects. That's the Staring at the Sun sound. And that's the closest they kind of came to the Britpop thing, I think that's very successful. They didn't do well as a single. The video didn't do particularly well. The better version for that, for me, is the stripped back acoustic version that they played on the PopMart Tour. But you can hear it, yes, you can hear the Britpop thing, you can hear obviously the dance music that's running throughout, you can hear Beck at times, that kind of his sort of sound. And if you put it up with records from bands like Eels, we've referenced Bjork already, it's a sound, there's a kind of consistent sound there. You'd be able to say that album comes from 1997. Now, the thing, of course, that they did was this idea of the dance music. It was a very common thing, of course, for dance artists to remix rock bands. And of course, they'd done that even better in The Real Thing and Lemon, and they'd be in quote unquote club hits when such a thing was possible. But what you said earlier, Dan, really struck me, right? This is from the era where a band or an artist or a group or a singer was very clearly defined by their genre. You had rock, you had pop. Within rock and pop, you had different genres, right? But genres didn't cross over. Now music has completely changed. Many of the contemporary artists, are mixing throughout their records, throughout even their own individual songs, different sounds. And that's totally cool and totally normal. Whereas in the 90s, for example, grunge and pop simply didn't meet. And when this record was released, grunge was probably still the dominant rock sound in the US, for example. And along come U2 with this album, which they call Pop. And, that album didn't make a lot of sense for US audiences. The PopMart Tour didn't make a lot of sense. A lot of half-filled stadiums. Interestingly, Rage in the Machine opened up a lot of those U2 gigs on the PopMart Tour in the US. And also, of course, Oasis playing support for them as well. So, when you mentioned Staring at the Sun, and I mentioned how it was a difficult song to play live, or rather I said how the acoustic version is the version that they played very successfully on the PopMart Tour. But one of the interesting things about Pop is that, with the exception of Staring at the Sun, which briefly appeared on the tour, on the Elevation Tour, the one that followed on from Pop, which didn't briefly appear, was included on the set list on that tour. This is not an album that U2 play live after PopMart. It's almost it's almost a forgotten record in that sense that live U2 completely jettison it. So it's an interesting point, I think, just about where this album sits in the U2 back catalogue.
That's a really, really interesting point. Because you mentioned earlier on, you mentioned that it was kind of like an unfinished album, and what struck me there in terms of what you said was it's really, really interesting to me that they didn't play the songs apart from Staring at the Sun at later gigs, and they were clearly unhappy with it afterwards, with the album, and they were unhappy with the production of the album, because even if you think back to when they released remember the two best of U2 albums they released kind of in the early 2000s. There was a gold one and a silver one, and I think the silver one was the one that dealt with the kind of later years of U2, and so there was a few tracks off Pop on that, but believe it or not, U2 remixed all of the tracks from Pop that are included on that for that album. So on that album you have Discotheque, you have Gone, and you have Staring at the Sun. And if you listen to those versions side by side with the versions that are on the Pop album, there's a very, very different, well, not a very, very different sound, but definitely a notably different sound between the tracks that ended up on the best of compared to the tracks on the original album. So it's they obviously have a really conflicting relationship with this album. And honestly, but like, why do you think that is, Paul?
I think there's a number of things. I mean, they obviously, not only do they remix for the best of, they also remixed for each single. So the singles, with the exception of Discotheque, the singles are different to what you hear on the album. The singles being Discotheque, Stare at the Sun, also If God Would Send His Angels, Please, and Last Night on Earth. Although they're all different versions. I mean, one of the big things, of course, about this record is that they were under a time pressure, because Paul McGuinness, who would later part company with the band, booked them the PopMart Tour in advance. The PopMart Tour was booked and ready to go, but the album wasn't ready to go. It wasn't finished. And I think that the fact that it was unfinished in the first, it was an unfinished record, and now they had lots of time to make it. The U2 records take years to make. But it was unfinished, and I think you can hear that, particularly sometimes in Bono's lyrics. You know, it's almost as if some of the lyrics are placeholder lyrics, and I think that some of the songs sound finished. Certainly, Discotheque lead single is finished. Certainly, Mofo sounds finished. After that, though, it becomes a little less clear about what's finished. But I'll tell you, though, one of the interesting things about this record as well, Dan, is that in the aftermath of it, they very much ditch the Pop sound very, very quickly. Once PopMart's over and Pop is done, they totally ditch it. They do they release the best of, which is the first best of is the 80s best of. And that's the next album they release. And that introduces a whole generation of people to not a whole generation, but people who maybe are a little bit younger, to the 1980s U2. It's led off by The Sweetest Thing, which again would not sit on Pop. It's very much an 80s sounding early U2.
And the advertising campaign behind that best of, that first best of, was massive. Every TV station, between every TV show, like it was promoted like no album I've seen since, really. Big time. Sorry, Paul.
And you're right. And it was the vintage U2. It was that they were marketing that and that they were promoting. It was completely different to what we'd heard on Pop. And then, of course, after the best of, the next record is All That You Can't Leave Behind, and the big tour around that. And of course, Bono said, we're back applying for the job of the biggest band in the world. So the Pop sits uncomfortably there on that. I mean, I would go, though, if I was said, give me your top three, I would say Discotheque has to go in there. Great lead single, great sound, quite long for a single. It's over 5 minutes long. Great video, or at least it's a funny video. And again, they're gone down that extremely ironic road. The whole concept for the album was that they'd locate it in a discotheque, so you can hear that. You know, they have a go at that at certain points on the album. They have located in a nightclub, and of course they open a nightclub in Dublin around the same time, the Kitchen nightclub under the Clarence Hotel. So Discotheque for me goes in there. I've always liked Last Night on Earth. I like the lyrics on it, like the chorus on it. Bono was having huge difficulties with his voice during this period. And so you hear The Edge does a bit more, there's a good bit more singing on the record than he might normally do, and he helps Bono through the chorus of Last Night on Earth. And probably, if I was asked, you know, it's a difficult one, it's always hard to pick three, I'd probably go with If God Would Send His Angels, which is a more kind of countryist sounding single. It's I like the lyrics as well. The lyrics are good, and there's a kind of they're good in the sense that they very much position U2 into the kind of country space, but they kind of update the country rock sound. And I think that's one of the interesting things about U2, that they're a band that can do that can pull that off. And, you know, Bono sings, you know, it opens with "Nobody made you do it, no one put words in your mouth." It's just he's just got a good way of connecting with now. It's questionable whether he maintained his lyrical ability right up into the present day, but I think the lyrics on Pop are actually very, very effective and very good. And I think If God Would Send His Angels is an example of pretty good lyric writing from Bono.
Yeah, they're incredible songs. All three of them, completely agree. Top notch. And really, if you look at this album, I would wager that there's kind of 7 tracks on it that really stand the test of time, and then the rest of them are good songs, but they're not they're not that memorable, right? And any album, in my view, that has 7 cracking songs on it and a few decent songs is a really, really good album. So the ones you mentioned, definitely those songs: Discotheque, A Stomper, Last Night on Earth, absolutely brilliant with that kind of "you gotta give it away" refrain and the really rock and roll guitar riff, and then If God Would Send Its Angels. So there's 3. Other songs I think make the album: Mofo, really, really good song. The bass in this is unusual for a U2 song in that it's not, at least for most of the song that I can hear, it doesn't seem to be Clayton playing the bass. It's a synth bass. The drums on this track are real drums, but they're sampled. So, you know, Mullins did play the drums on the track. Originally, when they were in the studio, they did have some digital drums on the track as well, but they eventually stripped those out. So the drums you hear are real drums, but they are heavily sampled, so they sound almost electronic and glitchy. Then The Edge is running his guitar through, I don't know what kind of, like, whammy pedals and fuzz pedals and all sorts of crazy guitar pedals, as Edge does. And he's really like The Edge is like, sometimes on this song anyway, and other songs, he's like a kind of the way he plays guitar, it's almost like a painter paints, and he uses effects like different colors on a canvas, you know, rather than kind of solely focusing on riffs. So he's famous for that kind of delay style of guitar. But on this song and other songs on this album and on Octung Baby and so on, he uses different colors, let's call them. So that's really interesting on this song. Bono's vocals are great, and the overall feel of it is very dance. It's probably the most dancey track on the album, and the most electronic sounding track. Then you have Staring at the Sun. We've already talked about that. That's on my top. I'm going for a top 7 tonight, really cheekily. But 3 of them are you've included already. Then you have Do You Feel Loved? I think it's a brilliant song. And then Gone, close to the end of the album. Another really, really strong track. And I think the way this album starts is particularly powerful, because it starts with like Discotheque, and then I think Mofo comes along, and it starts in quite a powerful kick in the face way, you know. It's like a punch to the head, but in the best way possible. And then there is slow tunes on it. There's one song. The name of the song escapes me.
If you wear that velvet dress, or Play by Mansy.
Miami is Miami. No, it is. It's
Miami,
it's if you wear there's one song that's really, really slow,
Yeah, if you wear
Yeah,
that velvet
that's the
dress, it's a
one.
slow
That's the one
one.
I'm
Yeah,
talking about. And it kind
yeah.
of has a kind of a strange drum beat behind Bono, and he sounds almost like he's singing out of tune in it at times. That's a strange song. But again, I don't dislike it as much as some people dislike it. I think it fits perfectly well on the album, you know?
I think it's terrific, and I think both If You Wear That Velvet Dress and Playboy Mansion are very very successful U2 tracks. If unloved. Now, If You Wear That Velvet Dress was included in the PopMart Tour. Playboy Mansion wasn't, if memory serves me correctly, and I would have heard If You Wear That Velvet Dress when I saw U2 on the PopMart Tour in Lansdowne Road on the 31st of August 1997. And it was just such a wonderful gig with great memories for me. One of the interesting things though about that gig was they did 2 shows in Lansdowne Road, but you could get tickets for the gig. So it wasn't entirely sold out, which for U2 playing in Dublin was it's not your normal experience of a U2 show. The next when they came and played 2 nights in Slane after All You Can't Leave Behind on the Elevation tour, both of those gigs were sold out, and the first one sold out in record time. So but the point I want to make about the Playboy Mansion is that it's incredibly of its time, because if you listen to the lyrics, Michael Jackson history, jokes about O.J. Simpson, it's very very much 1997, and probably hasn't stood the test of time from that sense in the way that a lot of U2 saw. I mean, U2 are very 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 polished. They have the resources, the time, the skills to make, really to create songs that are quite perfect, in the sense that there isn't, in pop, it's quite different in that there's bits and pieces around a tune. There's strange sounds coming through on synths and so on. And then, as I said, there's a lot of those lyrics that feel quite unfinished. Now, one of the things that I wanted to say, Dan, is that you didn't include there in your top 7 Wake Up Dead Man, which finishes the record.
True.
And I think Wake Up Dead Man is really, really effective. It wasn't included in the PopMart Tour, but they did play it in the famous Slane gig, which they made a DVD of when DVDs were a thing. U2 Go Home. Wake Up Dead Man was there just before they played Kite, and it was dedicated to the memory. Kite was dedicated to the memory of Bob Hewson, but to lead in, they played Wake Up Dead Man. I just have always found it a very, very effective song. And what I mean by that, when I say what do you mean by an effective song, a song that kind of makes you think, and the lyrics, of course, clearly are about, it's clearly about Jesus, and he goes, Jesus, I'm waiting here, boss. I know you're looking out for us, And again, I think it's quite funny, and again, to achieve that in a record, to have something that's quite humorous. I think is another reason to like pop.
Yeah, I saw someone writing about Wake Me Up Dead Man, or Wake Up Dead Man on online the other day. It was an academic from the UK, but they had photographs of the PopMart Tour, and Bono singing this song at one of the gigs, and Bono is singing it, and as you say, it's clearly about kind of Jesus and that, but the academic claims that Bono is looking up at himself on the screen at the gig, singing to himself, which is classic Bono in a way. But I just thought it was such a strange thing to do. I don't have, I don't want to start psychoanalyzing Bono or the song, because. He always has an interesting stage presence and does interesting things like that. I suppose to drag the crowd in and get them talking and getting I don't know.
I mean, one of the things about Bono is, he changes with every haircut, in the sense that what you get with every record and every tour is you get a different Bono, you get a different glimpse into him. I think the on PopMart is closer perhaps to the real Bono than a lot of the other stage shows, because he comes out fighting, and that was very much the PopMart thing. He comes out with this boxing thing that he was doing, and there's a sense of quite a combative Bono on the PopMart Tour. like what, and you mentioned academics writing about pop. There's acres of academic stuff about pop for some reason, acres of analysis. Some of it quite good and some of it quite interesting, and some of it, frankly, is not. But again, what I mean by that is that, you know, when you're analyzing a record like pop, there is a temptation, I think, to almost go overboard and almost to read too deeply into absolutely everything, perhaps in the way that your friend who you referenced there did. But look, for me, if I was to, if I saw the PopMart Tour, 40, I was like 14 at the time, it was in Lansdowne Road. It had a huge influence on me at the time. It opened up for me this sense of anything being possible. And I know that sounds something almost ridiculous and a bit trite, but that's sort of the feeling that I got from that pop tour and that pop gig that I saw, that anything was possible. And one of the interesting things about the night that I saw it was the night that Princess Diana had tragically been killed in a car crash. She died in the early morning of that day, and they played MLK for her, and they dedicated to her, and they had, you know, these Princess Diana images on the big screen. Anyway, just a moment in time, Dan. But if I was to sum it up, I'd say, listen, great record, get it, enjoy it. If you're familiar with it, keep listening to it, keep with it. If you're not familiar, go check it out. It gets, for me, I mean, if I was to give it a mark out of 10, I'm gonna go 8.5. You know, there's not marks being docked for any particular reason. Getting to 9 or 10 is a very, very strong standard. So it gets a very, very healthy 8.5. And I'll be listening to it for a long time to come.
Yeah, I'm going to give it an 8. I think the like what you said about it, kind of Bono having the fighting spirit at the time, I think is really interesting, and I think that it makes sense, as you say, that they had Rage Against the Machine and Oasis on that tour, two kind of fighty bands, and some of Edge's guitar work on the album actually sounds a bit like Tom Morello from Rage Against the Machine. So it's interesting that they were one of the bands on the on the tour. But look, my big takeaway from this album is that I was a late convert to U2, right? I wasn't a massive fan of U2 in my teens. It was kind of later on in life that I became a much bigger U2 fan. But Pop was an album that I always liked, even before I was a U2 convert, because it is kind of different from other U2 music. Some of it is kind of like those songs, Mofo, Discotheque, Do You Feel Loved, and so on. Like there is a heavy element to this album. Now there's the slow songs like Staring at the Sun and that, but there's this kind of heavier vibe to some of the songs that are, as I said, like getting kicked in the head by Bono in that fighty way. So it always kind of stood out to me as just a great album, apart from the U2-ness of it, if that makes sense. If you look at it in isolation from the rest of U2's career, which is very difficult to do, it's a quality album. And I think one of the reasons it's not given the regard that it deserves is because when you compare it to the rest of U2's career, it doesn't look as good, perhaps, but only because the other albums that U2 produced are just so good, are just so strong, are just, you know, full of so many classics that it's hard to compete with those. If any other band released an album like Pop, people would be talking about it for years and years and years. But because U2 are so big, Pop almost became a victim of the band's success, if that makes sense. So that's my takeaway from it. I agree. Listen to it. If you haven't heard it, do give it a chance. And enjoy it. And I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Big Album Show. One more takeaway thing, because it just popped into my head. Yes. On our first episode, Paul, which was about REM, and this is kind of a sneaky way of go back and listen to our previous episodes, folks. But you mentioned a really interesting fact about Out of Time by REM, that they had on the album cover, they had a petition or a letter you could send off or something. What was that again?
That was the that was it was a petition about about voting rights.
It was, yeah, and the reason that pops into my head is because I remember buying the cassette of Pop back in the 90s, and they had a link, not a link. They had it because this is kind of pre that just before the internet really got big, but they had information about an Amnesty International campaign on the album sleeve I had, which again I thought was really cool back then. and it was pretty cool.
No, it was,
so
no, I agree, Dan, and no, I agree, and it's interesting that you should bring that up. I mean, I remember that very well. Another thing that's very interesting, I know we've wrapped it up in the sense we've given our hot takes and we've given our marks out of 10. But one of the interesting things that it just something you said just reminded me of this. Lyrically, Bono has an eye to the future in a lot of the songs, and it's that moving towards the end of the millennium and saying there's a lot of optimism in this record. There's optimism about the tech age to come. So for example, in Gone, he says, the last of the rock stars when hip hop drove the big cars at the time when new media was the big idea. It was the big idea. There's a great optimism about technology, and the PopMart Tour is showing that off as well. What you can do with technology. There's a sense of technology will bring us all together. Like, how they got it wrong, but there was that sense. And one of the things there, he was seeing the demise of the rock star as the big dominant figure in music when he said the last of the rock stars when hip hop drove the big cars. So yeah, look, I remember that as well. Great. You had do you still have the cassette then?
I think I do somewhere. Yeah, lying about the place.
Great, love it. Brilliant.
Well,
listen, thank you for listening to the big. Well, yes.
The last thing I'll say, and I keep having loads of last things I'll say, but one of the things that I came across when researching for this episode was that the drummer of the Foo Fighters, Taylor Hawkins, had some strong opinions on this album, and didn't like discotheque as a track and stuff. But I think just because we're such big music fans, I think it'd be right if we dedicated the show to the memory of Taylor Hawkins, because we spoke about Taylor Hawkins on the Big Album Show before, briefly on our Alanis Morissette episode. And he was one of the big figures in rock music of recent times. So a shout out to Taylor's friends, family, and our sincere condolences on the loss of a great rock legend.
It's funny you should say that, Dan, because today I just happened to be listening to some of his work, and I came across as I was listening to songs, I came across Mary Jane, the Alanis Morissette track on Jagged Little Pill, and there is just the most terrific drum sound on it's just an incredibly, his use of the snare, it is just so effective, and it gives this track this forward momentum, and I think without him, that album would just be, would be completely different. So yeah, you're right to reference him. And of course, he was a big fan of Larry Mullen, and like Larry Mullen, and admired him. And yes, he was one of the many people who has feelings about pop. But great that we dedicate this pod to his memory. You're listening to The Big Album Show with Paul and Dan. Please remember to subscribe, hit like, and remember to follow us on our social media platforms at The Big Album Show.